Today we are looking at one of the strangest, most spectacular, and most critical games of Bobby Fischer's entire career. It's a game that the former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik went so far as to call Fischer's highest creative achievement. The year is 1972, and Bobby Fischer is about to enter the second half of his famous World Chess Championship match with Boris Spassky. It's game 13 of 24. Fischer is ahead by 2 points, but Spassky has been catching up, being the last one to win in game 11, and now, after a draw in game 12, Spassky has the white pieces and is looking to further close that gap, as he kicks the game off confidently with e4. But he has no idea what's about to hit him. Because Bobby Fischer had the tendency to stick to the same openings throughout his career with not a whole lot of deviation, it meant that when he did play something unusual, it was that much more powerful and unexpected. So in this game, when Fischer busted out Alekhine's defense with knight to f6, it came as an utter shock not only to Spassky, but to the entire chess world as well. First of all, because this opening never had a great reputation. Even to this day, it's not played all that often at the highest level, and the engine hates it. Fischer had played it a few times before, but always against weaker players. So he couldn't have picked a more surprising move, and what a savage move it was, especially when he's ahead in the match and all he really needs to do is play it safe and make some draws. To say to Spassky, "I'm gonna beat you now with this move that we both know is substandard," you just gotta love the disrespect and the fearlessness. So Spassky responds with the undisputed best reply, e5, forcing Fischer's knight to move a second time while grabbing some central space for free, following up with d4. Fischer bites at that center with d6, the most popular move, as is knight to f3 from Spassky. I like to play c4 here, forcing the knight to move a third time and taking even more control of the center. But that move can always be played later, since black doesn't have a good way to prevent it, and white might want to put his bishop to c4 instead, which is what Spassky ends up doing on his next move. g6 now from Fischer is a deviation from the main line, which is bishop to g4, which gets the light squared bishop developed before closing the diagonal with e6, which is the more popular method for developing the dark squared bishop. You get a little more control in the center by pushing this e-pawn, as opposed to playing g6. Spassky responds bishop to c4, attacking the knight. It's a good move, though the engine prefers c4, which would take more central control with the pawns while kicking the knight off of its central post, which would not result in black gaining a tempo with the attack on the bishop, as he does in the game after knight to b6. So after the retreat to b3, it's again black's turn to move, but that white bishop is on a powerful diagonal. So as always, pros and cons. Fischer now fianchettos, threatening to take once or twice in the center and then trade queens, which of course Spassky doesn't want, since then his opening advantage would pretty much evaporate. So what to do here as white? There's several good options. You could play knight to g5, attacking f7, maybe increase the pressure with queen to f3, maybe hop into e4 with that knight. Queen to e2 is good, getting off that file, supporting e5. But Spassky chooses a very passive move, knight b to d2. Okay, he's preventing the queen trade by blocking that file while developing a piece, but he's also blocking the dark squared bishop, and there's no great reason to commit that knight so early to d2 when you have alternative moves that would preserve the possibility of the more ideal knight to c3. So Fischer castles, after which we get another timid move from Spassky, h3. Why exactly he thought it necessary to prevent bishop to g4 at this stage, I don't know. Maybe he thought this move h3 is going to be useful no matter what, but white has better moves, including just castling, and if bishop to g4 comes, you can then play h3, when black cannot maintain the pin with bishop to h5, since g4 would trap the bishop, of course. So this move h3 is just way too slow and gives Fischer a chance to seize the initiative now with a5, a powerful move, threatening a4, trapping the bishop. Now, if white plays something like c3, giving his bishop a square, then black can gain more space with a4, followed by moves like knight to c6 and rook to a5, putting the squeeze on that e5 pawn, which white doesn't really want to trade off if he doesn't have to, since that's his best good foot soldier. So Spassky plays a4, halting that southern expansion. But after d takes e5 and d takes e5, we now have knight to a6. Fischer's going to be making a play for the A pawn now. Spassky doesn't seem too concerned though. He just calmly castles. Knight to c5 increases the pressure. And now queen to e2 from Spassky. He's getting off the open file, supporting knight to e4 next, maybe rook to d1, attacking the black queen. So Fischer responds queen to e8, getting right off that file and hitting the a4 pawn with 3 pieces now. And there doesn't seem to be a real straightforward way to save that pawn. But the engine does find some tricks for white here. I'll just show you one idea. White can play knight to d4, and if black takes the pawn, you trade a pair of pieces, and then follow up with knight to b5, threatening the fork, threatening rook takes a4, and white is actually winning here. But in the game, Spassky plays knight to e4. No tricks, no strings, just offering Fischer that free a pawn, which he now takes. Knight takes b3 is now threatened, damaging the white pawn structure, so Spassky captures on a4, and after knight takes a4, black is the superior side, but full disclosure, it's not by much. And white can actually get the pawn back by force with queen to c4, hitting both the knight on a4 and the pawn on c7. But after b5, queen takes c7, and queen to d7, black is the preferred side, having the bishop duo and the more active pieces. So Spassky plays a better move, rook to e1. And black is only slightly better. Spassky is ahead in development, his pieces are on nice squares. Fischer's knight is off in no man's land on a4, getting eyed pretty hard by that rook on a1, where it's more of a liability now than an asset, which is why Fischer now moves it back to b6. Now best for Spassky here is the odd-looking queen to d2, hitting a5 twice, and setting up a potential tactic with knight to f6 check, if the black queen stays on e8, which is why queen to b5 would be best. But then white has queen to g5, hitting e7, with the idea of queen to h4 and knight to g5. That's looking kind of nasty. So that's how white makes the most of his positional pluses here, but Spassky plays much less creatively with bishop to d2, which also seems to be okay, but it does allow Fischer to play a4, with no problems since the knight to f6 trick isn't present. And here the position only slightly favors black, but only if Spassky puts his bishop on b4, eyeing that e7 pawn, pinning it to the rook, tying the black queen down to its defense. With rook a to d1 coming, it's going to be quite inconvenient for black to develop his queen without losing this e-pawn. But Spassky goes for the much inferior bishop to g5, which also attacks the e-pawn, but unlike bishop to b4, it does not pin it to the rook. Although I should mention here that the move e6 is never really going to be good as long as white has this knight to f6 check. So with that in mind, I think Spassky wanted to play queen to d2 and then to b4, attacking that e-pawn further, which looks promising. However, it's based on an incorrect assessment that black cannot effectively counterattack, which he can, beginning with h6, now played by Fischer, attacking the bishop. It goes to h4, of course, still hitting e7, and here Fischer could just play g5 with a much better position. Was he worried about a piece sack on that square? I don't know. It wouldn't have worked for white anyway, but Fischer's move bishop to f5 seems to be just as good, maybe even better, with the potential to eliminate that beautifully placed knight on e4, after which e6 will be much more playable since there'd be no knight to f6 check. So Spassky now puts the question to Fischer's bishop with the move g4. But this is not best. Why weaken the kingside pawns like that when you can hit the bishop with knight to d4 instead? While placing a piece in the center, preventing bishop to e6 from being a good move, since you're covering that square as well. And this move knight to d4 also watches over the b5 square, which will be significant in this variation. Bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, e6, queen takes b7, when black has no counterplay with queen to b5, which would be good for black if this move knight to d4 hadn't prevented it. But after Spassky's move g4, Fischer now has his choice of bishop to e6 or bishop takes e4. Both moves favor black, but Fischer's choice, bishop to e6, is the strongest and quite possibly already winning. Spassky now tries knight to d4, but here it's not nearly as effective since it doesn't come with a threat to capture a bishop on f5, which means that black can get away with grabbing a second pawn with bishop takes e5. This wouldn't have worked if white had played knight to d4 a move earlier instead of this move g4, with the black bishop still on f5, since after knight takes f5, g takes f5, there'd be knight to g3, threatening both the bishop on e5 and the pawn on f5. But here, bishop takes e5 is the best move. Fischer doesn't play it though. He's a little too attached to that bishop pair and probably doesn't like knight takes e6, giving him the doubled isolated pawns, but he would be 2 clear pawns up with an attack on white's b2 pawn. So this was the most decisive route, but Fischer instead plays bishop to c4, attacking the white queen, which goes to d2, and again Fischer fails to play the best move, which is bishop takes e5. I'm guessing he's overly concerned with this move knight to c5, opening the white rook's eyes towards the bishop, towards the pawn on e7, but black can hang on to his advantage after this engine line, which I'm going to show you briefly, which starts with bishop takes d4, and then you follow up with g5. The black rook gets active, hitting the queen, who goes to e4, targeting e7, but black gets counterplay with queen to b5, hitting the knight, which takes on a4, followed by b3 with the fork. And the engine is giving bishop to d5 next, followed by queen takes a4, when black remains a healthy pawn up. So what exactly Fischer didn't like about this variation, or how much of it he even saw, who knows? But what we do know is that in this position, instead of playing bishop takes e5 like he ought to, Fischer went with queen to d7, choosing active play on this open file over material. Not the ideal way to play here, but this still favors black. Spassky responds with the best move, rook a to d1. This is better than trying to defend the e5 pawn with the less active f4, since bishop takes e5 can just be met with queen takes h6, threatening knight to g5. Black doesn't want that. So at this point, black's best move seems to be rook f to d8, since it would allow the black queen to go to e8, while keeping the rooks connected. And you're going to see why e8 is a good square for that queen in a moment after the move Fischer plays rook f to e8, which is a mistake as it allows white to totally equalize with the move b3, kicking this bishop around to a square where it will either come under attack by one of these knights or block the queen's access to d5, with the idea of knight to c5 next, hitting the queen, who won't have a lot of good squares, and who would like to go to e8, but can't. And you don't really want to play to c8, disconnecting the rooks. Now if the black queen were to stay on this d file, then the white queen could move somewhere, with the threat of the discovery by the rook. And there's a lot of other relevant variations as well. This game is getting pretty complicated, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but that just kind of gives you a general idea of what this move b3 is doing. But Spassky doesn't play that. He instead goes for the second best move in the position, f4, defending e5, at which point the engine actually suggests giving back the pawn with the move c5, just so that after knight takes c5, the black queen can get to the c7 square, with a bit of an advantage for black. But in the game, Fischer chose bishop to d5, threatening to take out that knight. Then c5 wouldn't even have to be a pawn sacrifice. But after Spassky's equalizing response, knight to c5, Fischer's queen is forced to retreat to an inferior square. And after queen to c8, Spassky has but one good move. Pause the video and try to spot it if you'd like. The best move for white, not played in the game, is e6. Now if black takes the pawn, then a white knight is going to post up on e6. You don't want that. White is threatening f5 to further attack the black king's pawn cover, but there are things black can do. He's got knight to c4, attacking the queen and the pawn on b2. Maybe he'll follow up with rook to a5 or knight to d6, all equalizing according to the engine. And I should mention that if rook f to d8 had been played instead of rook to e8 with the black queen on e8, then this move e6 would not be working due to the discovered threat to the white queen. But moving along, Spassky missed his best move, e6, and instead played queen to c3, allowing Fischer to prevent e6 by playing e6 himself, eliminating all of Spassky's compensation for his lost pawn. But the engine says that a3 was even better. A move which is so engine-y that I'm tempted not to even dignify it with the response. But the point seems to be that after b takes a3, there's going to be c6 and then knight to c4, followed by rook takes a3. But getting back to human reality, where Fischer plays e6 with the superior position and the extra pawn, is he winning yet? I don't know. Some good tries for white include knight to b5, preventing that a3 idea we just looked at. Bishop to f6, going for some kingside play, looking to eliminate the bishop on g7 and then push f5. But once again, Spassky plays much too passively with king to h2. It does make the king a bit safer, but that's about it. Fischer now basically has a free move with his choice of a variety of winning options, including c6, just giving the queen a square. The engine still likes a3 a lot, but Fischer goes for knight to d7, threatening knight takes c5 and then bishop to f8, followed by a3, nasty stuff like that. So Spassky addresses this threat of knight takes c5 by dropping his knight back to d3, which is a big blunder. He would have had much better practical chances after knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and queen to d3, with the idea of kicking the bishop off of c4 and then dominating on this open file with his queen and rook. And for many years, this was thought to give white decent drawing chances, until strong computer engines came along and vindicated Fischer's play by finding a stunning move, rook to a5, preparing to meet c4 with bishop takes c4. And after queen takes c4, black is the one who dominates this open file with rook to d5, pinning and winning this knight on d4, with the move c5 coming next. But Spassky made life very easy for Fischer in the game with his move knight to d3, allowing c5, just gaining space, opening up some squares for the queen, with an attack on the d4 knight, which jumps to b5, eyeing that outpost on d6. And you may be wondering what Fischer is thinking here. Why would he allow the knight to penetrate his position? So what do you think he plays next? Maybe bishop f8 to capture the knight when it gets there? No, he just attacks the knight with queen to c6, just welcoming it in to the d6 square, because he has a tactic that I can't imagine Spassky missed, and most of you will probably spot it pretty quickly as well, and that tactic, played now by Fischer, is queen takes d6, after which the recapture opens up the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, which of course captures the white queen. And after b takes c3, we reach an endgame that is totally lost for white. He's got weak pawns all over the place, still a pawn down, black has this dangerous passer, and despite having many winning options here, Fischer finds the strongest move, f6, just shutting down white's best counterplay. He's blocking the white bishop's access to the d6 pawn's promotion square, while preventing knight to e5 to trade off the d7 knight who is blockading the d6 pawn. So this leaves Spassky with very little active play. He tries g5 in an attempt to remove the f6 pawn so that he can get in his knight to e5. And it does work. After h takes g5, f takes g5, and f5, Spassky continues bishop to g3, planning knight to e5 next to remove this blockader of his only trump in this position, which is that passed pawn on d6. If he could trade knights and then get his bishop into f6, he might be able to make something happen. Of course, Fischer now has this protected passed pawn on f5 and is still comfortably winning, although a little less so after his next move, king to f7. He really should have just pushed his a pawn, and you'll see why in a moment. After knight to e5 check, knight takes e5, and bishop takes e5, Fischer really needs to get a rook in front of this d6 pawn before bishop to f6 renders that move impossible. But then Spassky will have this maneuver rook to f1 to f4 and then to the h file, with the potential to come in this way, which is very dangerous. Black is still winning, but if he played a3, then he'd have time to stop rook to f4 with rook to a4. But Fischer doesn't even play rook e to d8 like he should to get in front of the pawn. He tries b5, which appears to throw away the win since it gives Spassky a powerful but not very obvious way to draw the game with the move c4, which does a couple of things. It opens up a diagonal for the dark squared bishop to defend the promotion square of black's a pawn, and if bishop takes c4, the rook on d1 is now supporting the advance of the d pawn. If instead b takes c4, then there's still the idea of getting the rook to f4, then to h4, which black can no longer prevent with rook to a4 since the pawn is blocking that. So all these ideas combined appear to be sufficient to hold the position for white and draw the game. But Spassky now returns the favor with rook to f1, again giving Fischer the win if he plays a3. If white tries c4 here, then bishop takes c4 would render this move rook to f1 kind of useless, since if you try to go to f4 now and then to h4, bishop e2 is going to be in time to block that by getting to h5. But Fischer does not play the best move a3. He has another idea, which is good, but he plays it too soon, and that is rook to h8, offering a rook for that powerfully placed bishop on e5, who is protecting the d pawn and potentially covering the a1 square. But this again gives Spassky the draw. Fischer should have played a3 and then waited for rook to f4 before playing this rook to h8, since in this position, Spassky has a remarkable way to save himself, with bishop takes h8 followed by rook to e1, with the idea of giving back the exchange with rook takes d5 and then coming into e7 with check. And there's some lines where c4 will still be a good move, like if black immediately goes after the d pawn. But Spassky did not accept the sacrifice and instead played bishop to f6, just going for d7 and d8, which should still draw after a3. Here, bishop takes h8 would be much more risky than before, since white wasted this tempo with the move bishop to f6, and the a pawn is one step closer. Might still be a draw, but the safest option now is to play rook to a1, rook to d1, push the d pawn, which black will have to take out with the rook. And in the meantime, if black pushes his pawn to a2, white will have the option of capturing the bishop and then taking that a pawn. But once again, Spassky fails to seize his drawing opportunity and plays rook to f4. His idea, after a2 from Fischer, is to play c4, after which Fischer's capture with the bishop does not come with tempo on a rook, as it would have if the rook was still on f1, and generally speaking, f4 is a good square for this rook, with the potential to go to h4, maybe rook takes c4 at the right moment, but there's a problem with this move rook f4, which we'll see in a moment. Spassky continues by pushing his d-pawn, after which Fischer misses his strongest move, e5, which would either force the white rook to abandon the fourth rank, so no more rook to h4, or lose a couple of tempi with the move bishop takes e5 and then back to f6 to again try to support the d-pawn's promotion. But Fischer fails to properly punish this move rook to f4 with the winning e5 and instead goes for bishop to d5, which, as you might have guessed, once again gives Spassky the draw. And this time he finds the correct move, king to g3, at which point the game was adjourned until the following day. A practice that pretty much went away with the advent of strong chess engines, but in these days it was still pretty common in these top-level matches. And the way this worked was that one player would write down their next move, in this case it was Spassky's king to g3, so that Fischer didn't know what move would be played until the next day when the game was resumed. So this of course kicked off a marathon analysis session by both players. Fischer pulled an all-nighter studying the intricacies of this position. Spassky and his team put in many hours as well, and it's a fascinating moment in chess history because you basically have Fischer versus the Soviet analysis team starting the game from an objectively drawn position. So it's almost like a new game, like some kind of an endgame contest, and when it was resumed the next day, the game continued with no less than 26 consecutive flawless engine-like moves from each player, which is a testament to the incredibly high quality of the overnight analysis by both sides. So anyway, let's talk about this move king to g3. The threat is rook to h4, which will either force the elimination of one of black's important guardians of the d8 square, or allow a nasty infiltration with rook to h7 check, which won't end well at all for black. But Fischer has his own infiltration prepared with rook to a3 check, c3 blocks, and here if black promotes the pawn, then rook takes a1 followed by rook to h4 will give white the draw, with the white rook delivering perpetual check via h7 and h8 once the black rook moves somewhere. And of course, he's got to stay on that 8th rank to watch over the d8 square. So Fischer doubles up with rook h to a8. We have rook to h4, threatening that rook to h7. e5 from Fischer gives the king a square. The check is delivered. The king goes to e6. We have another check, driving the king to d6, followed by the winning of the e-pawn with rook takes e5. Looks scary. Spassky is threatening to win this pinned bishop on d5 with check, but Fischer strikes first, capturing c3 with check, and the white king heads toward his safest square, which after rook to c2 check will be e1. Fischer has no more good checks and therefore must lose his bishop, but he's definitely going to grab that d7 pawn with his king. The bishop falls with check. We have king to c6, another check, king to b7, rook to d7 check. Does Spassky have a perpetual here? No, since after king to a6, the king can run to a5 if necessary, and then to b4 or a4 if bishop to d8 check is played. Fischer's queenside pawn trio is now looking very ominous. He's now threatening rook to e8 check, followed by rook to e2, which would be curtains for white. So Spassky knows he needs to challenge the rook on c2, and he does it with the only move that doesn't lose, rook 7 to d2. The rooks are exchanged, and here come the black pawns. And again, Spassky has only one move that doesn't lose. Try to find it if you'd like, but here it comes. White's only hope is to create a passed pawn of his own with the move h4, planning h5. We have king to b5, h5 of course, and now c4, threatening c3 check, which would block the bishop's defense of a1, followed by the promotion of the a-pawn. So Spassky needs to get in front of that pawn with rook to a1. We have g takes h5. Here comes white's g-pawn, but here comes Fischer's h-pawn. Now, if bishop takes h4, then rook to g8 will pick up the g-pawn. That's winning for black. So Spassky pushes the pawn to g7. Fischer's h-pawn inches its way closer, actually about 2 inches closer if you want to be literal. We have bishop to e7 from Spassky, threatening bishop to f8, blocking the rook's defense of g8, where the pawn will promote. So Fischer gets in front of the pawn with rook to g8, which gives Spassky the opportunity to seal that rook in with bishop to f8, which is a lovely trick when you can get it, just shutting this rook out of the game using only a bishop and a pawn. But Fischer has his 5 advancing pawns, so securing the draw is still going to be very tricky for Spassky. Fischer continues h2, we have king to c2, and now king to c6, looking to come in this way and support the promotion of the f-pawn. Since his queenside pawns are doing just fine on their own, rook takes a2 is of course impossible due to the fork with b3. But Spassky has a strong response, rook to d1, just cutting off the black king. Fischer responds b3 check, the king goes to c3. Everything is under control, the position is still a dead draw. Fischer tries queening his h-pawn so that after rook takes h1, his king can get to d5. Spassky plays king to b2, covering the a1 square with his king so that his rook has more options. f4 now from Fischer. Spassky delivers a check. The king goes to e4. Rook to c1 threatens to take on c4. The king defends, at which point Spassky has 2 drawing moves, both of which involve getting his rook to the f-file. He can play rook to f1 directly, attacking the f-pawn, and then back to c1 if the king defends, attacking c4 again. He can also start with rook to c3 check, headed for f3 if the king defends c4, and white will be able to hold the draw. He can even still get his bishop to help out with the defense at the right moment if necessary. But Spassky, after playing 26 flawless moves, either came to the end of or forgot his previous night's analysis and played the unfortunate blunder rook to d1 check, which accomplishes nothing and only helps the black king get to e2. If white would have begun with rook to c3 check, then king to e2 would have allowed rook takes c4. Then white would have had just enough time to get this rook back to the first rank to guard a1 so that he can play king takes b3, then eliminate the a-pawn, after which he can sacrifice his rook if he needs to for this f-pawn. Then black will have no more pawns and the game will end in a draw. But here Spassky has no immediate rook takes c4, and so is essentially a tempo down compared to that drawing line rook to c3 check, after he plays rook to c1. Fischer pushes his f-pawn. Now if Spassky tries rook takes c4, there's f2, when rook to e4 check can be met with king to f3, which is black's only winning move, and one that wouldn't be possible if the pawn were still on f3. So you can see how that single tempo makes all the difference. Spassky tries bishop to c5 instead. It's equally hopeless, allowing Fischer's rook to get back in the game with rook takes g7. Spassky plays rook takes c4. Now with the bishop's help, he has the idea of playing rook to e4 check, followed by rook to e3, attacking two of Fischer's pawns at once. He's still dreaming of sacrificing his rook or bishop to eliminate all three black pawns. Either scenario would be a draw, but Fischer now shatters that pipe dream with rook to d7, threatening rook to d1 and the promotion of the a-pawn. Rook to d2 check is also a threat. Spassky plays rook to e4 with check, but after king to f1 and bishop to d4, he had to stop the black rook's infiltration. Fischer plays the final move of this magnificent game with f2, which causes Spassky to resign. Fischer's f-pawn is much too close to the promised land. It can't be stopped. The threat is simply rook takes d4, followed by king to e2, and if rook to e4 check, then there's king to f3, and the pawn will promote. If this bishop moves, then the rook can come into d1, and the a-pawn promotes. Even if the bishop sacrifices itself for the a-pawn, there's still the f-pawn to contend with. If white instead sacrifices the bishop for the f-pawn, then after rook to a4 and rook to d1, black's got rook to b1 check coming next to drive that king away from the defense of a1, where the pawn will promote. So what an incredible journey that game was, with so many beautiful twists and turns, some very instructive moments, and in a way, it could be considered the climax of Bobby Fischer's entire chess career, as it effectively sealed Spassky's fate in the match, putting him 3 points behind Fischer, as opposed to him only being 1 point behind had he won this game. And I think Fischer's decision to open with Alekhine's defense was way ahead of its time, being willing to play a substandard opening move just to get the opponent out of his preparation. That's something we often see Magnus Carlsen and other top players doing today. So thank you for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel and hit that bell notification if you want to see more epic games by Fischer and by other great players in the near future, and I'll see you soon.